Well, in the interest of time, while you're still taking your casks, I'm going to introduce our next speaker. And I'm very pleased that we have Dr. Is this on? Closer? Okay, better? Okay, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Cherie Armour. She's at Queen's University in Belfast, Northern Ireland. I have known Cherie for a long time, not in the least because she's an associate editor for the European Journal of Psychotraumatology, so handling all these papers you are submitting. She has also organized one of the previous ESCSS conferences, the European conferences, and now that we have the French organization that will soon also be affiliated with the European one and maybe also the global one, who knows, we will hope to see you there too. Having said that, Cherie is going to talk to us about the social life of trauma. It's a very intriguing topic. Symptom networks, support systems, and post-traumatic trajectories. Cherie, it's all yours.
Is that better? Much better. Okay. So thank you so much for the invitation to present at your conference. I'm very happy to be here. And thank you for the introduction, Miranda. As Miranda had said, I'm going to present on the social life of trauma, symptom networks, support systems, and post-traumatic stress disorder. The first thing that I wanted to do was just share with you a little bit about our lab at Queen's University Belfast. So this is a very busy slide. I do admit that. I'm not going to go through everything on the slide. But I just wanted to tell you that in our lab, which is the Stress, Trauma and Related Conditions Lab, we focus on all aspects of psychological trauma research. So really everything that happens before, during and after trauma. And this means that we're very interested in things like definitions and conceptualizations. We're interested in things like measurement and prediction. So we're asking things like, what do we actually talk about when we talk about trauma? What does trauma mean for various individuals? We work with lots of different traumatized populations. So you can see on the left-hand side of the screen there, we work with maltreated children and adolescents. We work with military personnel and their families, and even those who have, on a population level, been displaced due to armed conflict. We're interested in what we talk about both sides of the coin after experiencing psychological trauma. So we're interested in the adverse psychological outcomes of trauma, so PTSD, and a whole range of comorbid disorders like depression, anxiety, dissociation, and so on. But more recently, we have become interested in the other side of the coin, which is the pathway towards psychological well-being. So why is it that 2/3 of the population remain resilient after experiencing a potentially traumatizing event? And then because we're interested in those pathways to outcome, we're really interested in what happens in the middle. So we're interested in trying to understand the mechanisms behind what puts people on a particular pathway to distress or wellness. So that's just a little overview of what we're doing at the Stark Lab at Queen's University Belfast. I also wanted to say that when we're conducting our research, we produce a lot of reports, and I think this is very important for researchers who are in the room to understand that the point here is not just to produce academic publications, but to actually produce academic reports and policy briefs so that we can try to shape policy and shape services for individuals who have experienced trauma. So on this slide here, you can see a range of reports that we've conducted in relation to military mental health and veterans and their families who live in Northern Ireland. As a result of these reports and our recommendations, we were able to leverage funding from Westminster, which is the UK government, to initiate a specialised office called the Veteran Support Office in Northern Ireland that coordinates all of the supports and services for our veteran community and their families. Similar to this, we've produced many reports related to violence against women and girls, and in particular, we've had a focus on coercive control and on police responding in the context of domestic violence. And more recently, we've been commissioned by the Commissioner for Victims of Crime to conduct research on male victims of intimate partner violence. And I'm just sharing these with you to demonstrate that the pathways from research to real change for trauma victims, and to show you the importance of the work that we all do, so all of us in the room do, to support those who have experienced trauma. What I'd like to do now is speak specifically about trauma, PTSD, and social support. And more specifically, I'd like to ask, how does PTSD symptomatology behave cross-sectionally in the context of social support? So first, let's reorientate ourselves to the situation of trauma and PTSD. And I recognise you've been speaking about that a lot yesterday and today, but I just wanted to re-emphasise that trauma is an experience that's rare and overwhelming for an individual, which typically does result in injury or threat to life of the self or others. And when we look at some of that epidemiological research, we see that the prevalence of trauma in society is actually very high, with approximately 7 out of 10 adults reporting experiencing at least one potentially traumatizing event. And we know that after experiencing trauma, the conditional risk of developing PTSD was 3.9%, as reported by the World Health Organization. Unfortunately, we do live in a time where exposure to potentially traumatizing events is ever on the increase. We have a disturbingly high number of armed conflicts and crises. So we have more recently the situation between the US and Iran. We have the Russian invasion of the Ukraine. We have Israel and Palestine. With all of these geopolitical conflicts, the likelihood is that we will have more people exposed to potentially traumatizing events. And if we think that 1/3 of those people go on to develop a PTSD, then we will see those rates rise as well. And of course, there's other potentially traumatizing events like climate crises and so on. With this increasing rate of trauma and thus mental health outcomes, it's more important than ever that we do work to identify how we can best support people in the population. And this brings me to the concept of social support. So social support is a key mechanism as to how we can help people in the recovery after experiencing trauma and PTSD. But I think often what happens is that people think about social support as one concept, where actually social support is an umbrella term. I imagine you guys have talked about this yesterday and maybe even this morning. But there's a difference between people who have received support and how they perceive that support. So the perceived support refers to a person's subjective judgment, and that helps of the help that's given in their time of need. The received support is much more specific in terms of quantifying what types of supports that person is getting. And then we also have to think that support comes from lots of different avenues. So support can come from friends, from loved ones, families, from organizations, and also from wider society. And then we have to also subdivide the type of support that people might receive. So we have emotional, informational, esteem, and tangible. So these are all different types of support, and how someone perceives that support can be really important for their ongoing recovery or for protecting them against developing PTSD in the first place. But on the whole, the literature does tell us that when we're thinking about mental health or mental ill health, how people perceive the social support that they are in receipt of is more important. So perception of quality is more important than quantity. Okay, it's also important to recognise that research which focuses on predicting who will develop PTSD after being exposed to trauma is not necessarily something new. In fact, this idea of predicting who will be on a pathway to recovery or to illness is a very long-standing interest within the field. And back even in the 2000s, there were some meta-analyses conducted by Bruin and Ozer, and they reported on a series of individual things that might predict someone's outcome after being exposed to trauma. And the interesting thing here is that both of them demonstrate that social support is an important predictor of outcomes. Now, and I will come back to this point afterwards, they say that social support is an important predictor, but what they don't say is why it's an important predictor. And I think focusing on the why at this point in time is very important, so we will come back to that. I did just want to say as well that we have conducted a number of studies that have supported the value of social support for people who have experienced trauma. And we have done this with a range of different trauma populations. So we have found social support to be a good protective mechanism in children who have experienced adversities, in military veterans, and military veterans across different geographical locations actually. So in Northern Ireland, the US, Canada, Denmark, so on. But also at the population level, when we look at those epidemiological studies, we've shown that when people experience childhood adversity, those who have a good perception of social support in their life are less likely to develop those adverse psychological outcomes. But a lot of this research is conducted cross-sectionally. And another cross-sectional research endeavour, which is perhaps slightly newer, is the one that relates to network analysis. So network analysis is really something where we are trying to get at the nuance of individual symptoms and look at how those symptoms relate to each other in an overall network. And recent network analyses have begun to integrate social support directly into these overall symptom systems. So these studies suggest that social support is not just an external predictor, but something that is actually integrated in the symptom mechanism pathway. So it has shown that negative associations with key PTSD symptoms, such as sleep disturbance and fatigue, may actually dampen other symptoms within the overall network. So there's something going on there at a nuanced symptom level basis in terms of how social support is dampening or activating various PTSD symptoms. And that's the field of network analysis. Now, surprisingly, there's lots of network analysis studies which have been done looking at these PTSD networks, and they bring in lots of comorbidity, so depression, dissociation, suicidality. There's not much literature on network analysis and social support specifically. And even this study by Chen, they looked, actually it's on the next slide, so they looked at social support as one concept, yet we've just talked about the importance of looking at the nuance of social support and looking at the different ways in which it's being received or perceived. Okay, so what I would like to talk about now is specifically about trauma, PTSD and social support, but asking this time, how does PTSD symptomatology behave across time? So here I'd like to speak about some of my work on PTSD trajectories. To do this, I think we have to firstly talk about the science of symptom chronicity. So assessing PTSD symptomatology over time has repeatedly shown that people take different pathways. So there are different courses or trajectories of that PTSD symptomatology. And this is really important because if we can understand why one person might remain highly symptomatic and have really chronic symptoms over time compared to someone who's resilient with little symptoms over time, if we can find what differentiates that pathway for individuals, it can really feed back into development of interventions and treatments. So this is the kind of risk and resilience modelling stuff again. I should say this research is not new. There's a lot of studies on this, maybe 20 years worth of research trying to think about how we predict people's course of symptomatology. Typically when this research is done, it's conducted on large samples and it uses a statistical modelling process called growth mixture modelling. And the growth mixture modelling identifies the trajectories, and then typically people will use regression to identify membership in those particular trajectories. Now, the consensus very recently in the literature, the consensus for a long time within the literature was that we have these 4 different trajectories of PTSD symptomatology. So you can see on our graph here that we have low symptoms. This could also be regarded as the resilient group. So they have low symptoms to begin with and remains low over time. We have a decreasing trajectory that is representative of that natural recovery we see of people who have post-traumatic stress disorder. Then we also have the highly symptomatic with significant symptoms and distress over a longer period of time. That would be the high symptoms or the chronic group. And then we also have the increase in trajectory group, which could sometimes be referred to as that delayed onset trajectory for PTSD symptoms. So initially, not much distress going on, but as time goes on, we see the symptoms arise. And there's lots of research and debates as to why particular trajectories work in the particular ways that we don't really have time to go into in any depth today. But what I did want to say is, a second ago I said the consensus was that we have 4 trajectories. Well, very recently I've been involved in a large consortium where we conducted a meta-analysis of all of the growth mixture modelling studies on PTSD symptom trajectories. We had 99 studies, and we had 113 samples across the board, so quite an extensive systematic review. The results of that review were that, I think first caveat is most of these studies have been conducted in North America, so there were 21 countries in total, but most of them were concentrated in North America, and you can see that on the little heat map there. But the surprise to all of us involved were that we identified 5 core PTSD symptom trajectories. So as we looked across the different studies, most studies report 4, but there's a difference in what those 4 are. And when we pull all that together, what we're actually seeing is a 5th trajectory that is really for the moderate symptoms, and we're seeing that on average about 30% of the group. So this could be a sub-threshold type symptom trajectory. The other point to make is that when we look at the course of the symptomatology, the most common trajectory is the resilient one, which is good news because it tells us most people are resilient to potentially traumatic experiences. And actually there was a recent meta-analysis that pulled some of this together that said on average for all those exposed to trauma, about 2/3 of individuals remain resilient and only 1/3 develop a post-traumatic stress outcome. Now, what about the predictors? Because we're interested in what predicts the membership across those different groups. In this meta-analysis, what I can say is that there was a huge variability on what predicts membership in these groups. And this is problematic within the field because if we have such a huge variability, it's very difficult to get a grasp on consensus and to get a grasp on what are the core predictors. This is driven, I think, sometimes by researcher choice. So researchers choose to look at the predictors that they or their labs are interested in rather than there being some set of like a core outcome set that these must be the ones that we test. And I think that would be useful within the field, but just to say there's variability at the moment, so no real clear consensus on the predictors. So that does take me to my next question, which is why might social support therefore be important for these trajectories? I wanted to orientate you to some of the research of myself and my lab where we have conducted these trajectory studies and specifically looked at social support. So the first series of research is with military veterans. We've ran this study a number of times with veterans from Denmark, from Canada, from Northern Ireland, from the UK. And what we have found is a really common set of these 4 trajectories. So this is the original consensus. We found these 4 trajectories, which is the same graph that I presented earlier on. I want to specifically speak about this model because this is from data from military veterans in Israel. And this data was collected over a 20-year period. So as longitudinal studies go, this is a pretty long study, right? Over 20 years. And yet we still saw those 4 trajectories coming out. What we also found that was interesting in the context of this is when we looked at the membership of the trajectories, and we looked specifically here at social support, and social support based on the support from the network, from the family, and from the wider society, what we found was that the more support someone received, the less likely they were going to be in that chronic group, which is the really high symptoms across time. Or we could say that the other way, that the less support that they received, the more likely they would be in that chronic group. And that's actually what the slide is showing here in terms of our odds ratios. So we see significant results across those 3 different domains of social support. We also have a study where we had did a same trajectory model in Colombian individuals who had been exposed to armed conflict. In this study, we had collected data across 3 time points and across 12 months. We have 256 individuals, and we've used all the standardized measures of trauma, PTSD. For social support here, we really did look at perceived social support, looking at the multidimensional scale of perceived social support. And we use the same statistical modelling that others have used. So we use latent class growth analysis of the PTSD symptoms and then multinomial logistic regression to look at the predictors. Here's what we found. So again, we're finding those 4 symptom groups, which are mapping on to the original theory by George Bonanno as to why these symptom groups are such, and we have the 4. But really interestingly, what we found is that a lack of perceived support was associated with a greater chance of being in that chronic versus the low PTSD symptom groups. Now, I think this is interesting because this is a really different cultural context in which this study has been conducted, but we're finding the same results. To take you to a different culture and a different context, we did the same study with the COVID-19 Psychological Wellbeing Survey. So this is with UK adults. So this study was a multi-wave longitudinal study of wellbeing during the first UK lockdown. We started our data collection on the 26th of March, and the UK went into lockdown on the 23rd of March. So we were one of the first teams in the UK to really look at psychological wellbeing in that very early period of the COVID-19 lockdown. We had 1,958 individuals at baseline, and then we see a slight bit of attrition over the subsequent waves. Again, we used growth mixture modelling. However, this time we conducted growth mixture modelling on anxiety, depression, and PTSD symptoms. So we find, again, these 4 trajectories. And as you can see from these profile plots, the trajectories themselves are very similar across all 3 mental health outcomes, given that each have the similar intercept, so the similar starting point, and then the similar slope, so how they move across time. So we had a low stable group uncovered, where individuals had the low levels of symptoms consistently, a high group where individuals consistently have high levels of symptoms, and those symptoms are above those clinical thresholds for diagnosis. We have that improving group where they have initially high symptoms and improve over time. And then we have also an increasing group where they start off with low symptomatology but increase over the length of the study and increase to levels above clinical thresholds. Now here, interestingly, we did have a measure of social support in this data set, but for this particular study, which is published in Psychiatry Research, we decided to look at a series of predictors that you can see on this slide, and we looked here at loneliness. But of course, many people would argue that loneliness is a proxy for social support. And again, what we found was that those who reported being more lonely were more likely to have those higher symptoms across time. And we saw that across the different models. Now, in a separate study, we actually looked at loneliness specifically, and we looked at what were risk factors for loneliness. And without going through everything on the slide, I'll just say that higher levels of social support were regarded as protective factors. So those who reported more social support also reported being lonely. So that just adds evidence to my point of loneliness and social support being almost proxies for each other within this data set. Okay, now I would really like to talk about specifically social support. I think you have probably made the case yesterday in different talks that you have received, and I hope I've made the case today to say that we're confident that social support is a protective factor after people experience trauma. So we know this. So the question is not, is social support protective after we experience trauma? The question now becomes, in what way? So why is social support protective after we've experienced trauma? There's lots of models around this. There's lots of theoretical positions. There's a lot less work that dives into the specific mechanisms. So I'm going to talk about some of this today. And I think it would be remiss of me not to mention the 2 main models, so the buffering support and the main support. So you may have talked about these already. I'm conscious that you may have had these discussions yesterday. But the buffering support model says it's beneficial only under times of high stress. So it buffers the stress as it happens. And it says that individuals with high levels of perceived support will have fewer negative health effects following the stressful event because the buffer is in place. So it's protective. There's also a different model that takes a slightly different slant on things and says that it's called main support. This says that the social support is beneficial to an individual's life across the board. It's not just in times of acute stress or trauma. So it's constantly protecting individuals, which means that when individuals do experiencing stress, then that predicts positive physical and mental health outcomes after the stress. So 2 models about why social support works with a slightly different slant on them. Because we have these 2 models, it is important to then think about some of the theoretical perspectives behind this. And I do think that 2 useful theoretical frameworks help us think about why social support matters so much for these trauma outcomes. The first is Wise's social provisions theory. And the basic idea here is that social networks do not only give us generic support, but different relationships provide different kinds of psychological resources. And Wise describes these provisions being things like attachment, social integration, opportunity for nurturance, reassurance of worth, guidance, reliable alliance. So lots of positive things that we might get from the social support or our networks that provide social support. But what is helpful about this model is that it lets us move beyond that idea that support is simply something that is present or absent. Instead, we can ask what kind of support is missing, and say a person may be surrounded by others, but you can be surrounded by lots of people and still lack things like reassurance of worth, or lack guidance or a reliable sense that someone will be there when you need them. And according to this framework, deficits in particular provisions may contribute to experiences such as loneliness, boredom, low self-esteem, anxiety. So this helps explain why support might change across the lifespan, because people, as they age, may gain or lose different relationships within their life. So we can see a change in that across the lifespan. So that was Wise's social provisions theory. The second framework I wanted to talk about is Antonovsky's sense of coherence. So it's argued here that close supportive relationships are a key foundation for developing a strong sense of coherence. And the sense of coherence refers to the extent to which someone feels comprehensible, manageable, and meaningful in terms of their own life. And this is especially relevant, right, in trauma, because trauma can disrupt all 3 of those things. And when someone experiences one of those potentially traumatizing events, there can be lots of disruption in their sense of coherence. It can make the world feel more chaotic than it did before. Life might feel empty rather than feeling meaningful. But supportive relationships at the time of the trauma might actually help someone restore their sense of coherence and reconnect with things like meaning and purpose. And we know some of those fundamentals for helping people with mental ill health is them having a sense of meaning and purpose in their life. So we can see how that sense of coherence ties these things together. But the point is that both theories here point in the same direction. So they say that social support is not just something in the background, but social support is part of an overall relational structure through which people maintain things like self-worth, and they make meaning of the experiences they have in their life. And they do that in the context of other people and other people that they engage with throughout their life. So, now that we've covered some of the models and we've talked about some of the theories, and we've said we shouldn't really be asking, is social support important? We should be asking, why is social support important? I have done quite a lot of reading and research on this, so I want to change gear a little bit and talk about what are the underlying mechanisms as to why the social support might be so protective. And I think that the consensus within the literature and my own work is that there's 4 main mechanisms. And these are related to appraisals on cognitions post-trauma, emotion regulation and processing or disclosure, increasing of coping resources that people have at their disposal, and then also reducing negative social reactions. So what I'd like to do is try to just look at the nuance of some of those and talk about that in a little bit more detail. I think when we think about shaping threat appraisals and cognitions, to me, this speaks quite a lot to Janif Billman's shattering of world assumptions theory. And I wanted to say that now as I go through the 4 mechanisms, because you'll see some relations in what Janif Billman says in that theory and some of these mechanisms. But essentially what we're talking about is that once people experience those potentially traumatizing events, they're really trying to make sense of what happened to them and why it happened to them. So they're integrating danger, responsibility, trust, their own vulnerability. And when you have supportive people in your environment after that trauma event, they can help you with how you appraise that experience. So they can help you with how you're thinking about that experience. So you could have some individuals in your life that actually help you appraise your experience as being something that you can survive, rather than something that might be potentially catastrophic for you in your life. So they help reduce things like self-blame, and they help reinforce that sense that actually the world and the people in it is not a really dangerous, unsafe place. They can help restore this sense that actually the world can be safe and people in the world can be safe and we can connect. This matters a lot because when we think about the cognitive models of PTSD, they really tell us that those maladaptive appraisals that people have after experiencing trauma, so things like, I'm permanently damaged, no one can be trusted, or the trauma was all my fault. Those maladaptive appraisals are really damaging for somebody's psychological well-being. And if the social support shifts those appraisals to less threatening or less alienating or damaging perspective, then that gives a plausible mechanism as to why it has that protective effect. And of course, it's all well and good me saying this, but we need to look at the evidence also that supports this. So there is evidence in a couple of studies that I've mentioned here. So there's Rohnbach and colleagues in 2011, and then Woodward in 2015. So in the first study, they examined the relationship between perceived support, post-trauma cognitions and PTSD, and suggested that the trauma-related cognitions really help explain the link between social support and PTSD. And then Woodward, slightly later, found that social support from family and friends and other close relationships was associated with PTSD, but this was through those post-traumatic cognitions. So we can see some evidence for that particular mechanism. Regarding emotion regulation and processing, we talk a lot about emotion regulation in the context of PTSD and how dysregulation is maladaptive, whereas regulation or successful regulation processing is adaptive. So if we think about this in the context of supportive relationships, then these relationships can create a context in which people are better able to disclose the trauma and disclose what happened to them. They are better able to tolerate distress. We have a particular study on distress tolerance as a supportive mechanism after people have experienced, I think the trauma group in that case was sexual assault. But people can then disclose and process their trauma memories rather than trying to avoid them. And if you have someone in your social support network that's a supportive listener, then they can help regulate some of those overwhelming effects simply by being present, by validating your experience, and by not escalating things like threat or shame by their response to your disclosure. And again, this has been studied in a few different papers and meta-analyses that have looked specifically at social bonds in PTSD. And Szywerska, hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, and Cloyter actually situate PTSD not just within the individual, but within the wider social ecology of someone's life. And that's important in the context of social support and what we're talking about. So their point is that trauma recovery happens in that relational context. So again, we're hearing the same thing. Human beings regulate threat, distress, and safety, not only internally, but also interpersonally. So in terms of how other people are doing that within their broader network. So it may make the trauma, ultimately, if you have these supportive relationships, people may be able to speak more about the trauma, think more about the trauma, and therefore it makes the processing of the trauma more successful. And again, as I'm using this language, we can relate that back to some of those traditional cognitive models of PTSD and how that develops. Okay, a third mechanism then involves coping resources, self-worth, and perceived control. And this is really where we see that stress buffering model and also those kind of conservation of resources theories or ideas becoming useful, because social support may increase a person's practical and psychological resources at precisely the time when they need it. So if someone needs help with this at the time of trauma, then the supportive relationships can do that precisely at the right time. Supportive others can provide the advice, the reassurance, the practical help, and a sense that the person isn't facing the trauma on their own. They have people there for them when they need them. And that may strengthen someone's coping efficacy and reduce their idea of helplessness. It may also restore some degree of predictability and control that has been shattered by the trauma. Again, shattered, we think about the theory of Janov Bowman's shattering of world assumptions. So this helps has a restorative process. But one of the most useful recent contributions here is a publication by Wang and colleagues, which looks specifically at longitudinal studies in relation to PTSD and social support. And they found evidence that this happens in a reciprocal manner. So importantly, higher social support has predicted later lower PTSD, but also PTSD predicted lower later social support. So in other words, social support works reciprocally, but it seems to be genuinely protective, whilst PTSD symptoms in and of themselves can actually erode the social support over time. So this tells us two things. First, support is not just a byproduct of someone doing well, it appears to contribute to someone doing better a long time. And then second, once PTSD symptoms do emerge, they may interfere with things like trust, intimacy, disclosure, social engagement, and all of these things weaken that social support. So we've got this back and forward happening. So ultimately what we're saying here in a longitudinal framework is that social support and how it integrates with PTSD is a dynamic process rather than something that happens static. When people talk about social support, it's easy to imagine support as something positive that's either present or absent. We talked about that at the beginning. But the literature really increasingly shows that negative reactions may be especially important. So we've seen here from studies like Zalta and colleagues that the relationship between social support and PTSD was stronger when social support was measured in terms of negative social reactions than when it was measured as general support. So again, in other words, they found that perceived social support was more strongly related to PTSD than things like structural or enacted support. And the distinction here again, I think, is really important because it suggests that what protects people is not just how many other people are in their network or how many people are around them, or whether the support is theoretically available, but the prediction here, or the mechanism here, is whether they feel understood, believed, accepted, and not blamed. So again, that's the difference between the objective presence of the support and the subjective interpretation of the quality of that support within somebody's life. These are two different things. Now, there's a lot on this slide, sorry, but there has been some studies, again, which have looked at social reactions to disclosure of interpersonal violence and found that negative reactions to disclosure were associated with worse psychopathology. Interestingly, positive reactions did not show equally strong protective effects. That can sound really surprising at first, but I think it does make sense because a negative social response, so if someone discloses a trauma and they're not believed, or their experience is minimized, or they're blamed for a situation, or there's a lot of criticism in terms of that disclosure, or there's then the very nature of that may actually intensify how someone appraises and feels about their experience. So it might intensify things like shame. It might reinforce mistrust of others, worsen the avoidance behaviors, so on and so forth. So one reason social support protects may be that it prevents something quite damaging, and it's because social support might prevent this idea of social invalidation. And this means that mechanistically we need to think of social support on two layers. So one layer is the provision of all those positive responses, so things like warmth, closeness, practical help. The other is the absence of these things, but also behaviours from those that you disclose to that can intensify things like shame and isolation. And recent evidence suggests that the second layer may be particularly influential here. So this distinction is important because it pushes us towards the mechanism. It says again, and I know I'm kind of re-emphasising this, but it says again that just because you have a large network, or theoretically there's lots of support available to you, it really depends on the person's appraisal of that support. So the active ingredient seems to lie in social quality, much less than social quantity. So, yep, where does this leave us? That's good time, and I've got about 5 minutes left. So where does this leave us? Well, I think it leaves us with a really useful and clinically realistic model. So social support appears to protect against PTSD, not because it magically removes the impact of trauma. That would be a bit silly, just to think it magically removes the impact. We need to understand the nuance. And the nuance is social support actually changes the context, so the interpersonal context in which trauma is interpreted and then also managed. So support of others can actually help an individual or help a person to have a less kind of catastrophic meaning making out of the event that they've experienced. They may reduce the shame, they may reduce the self-blame, they may help somebody to regulate their emotions, regulate those overwhelming emotions that people experience. They might help someone to be able to disclose and discuss and therefore process their particular experience. And critically, they may protect against some of those harmful responses, such as blame, disbelief, criticism, invalidation, that otherwise really do entrench those PTSD-related beliefs and the resultant distress of that. So at the same time, we can't forget that once PTSD symptoms are established, those symptoms can themselves disrupt support. So avoidance, emotional numbing, anger, mistrust, social withdrawal, they can all sustain or break relationships. And they're really important in that cycle, that reciprocal cycle for PTSD. And that's why we do believe PTSD and social support to be dynamic and reciprocal. And sometimes people can get locked in that cycle. From a clinical and public health perspective, the literature does suggest that we should not treat social support just as this vague thing in the background, but we really should think about it more precisely, thinking specifically about those mechanisms and how those mechanisms and what we understand from the literature and the research can actually be put back into how we engage with individuals after trauma. So we should be asking questions like, does this person feel believed? Do they feel safe in disclosing the details of their trauma? Are the people in their life either helping them to reduce the shame, or are they increasing it? What are the interpersonal family dynamic networks that are happening for an individual? And then are people strengthening coping and connection, or reinforcing helplessness and alienation? These questions that we should ask people from a public health or clinical perspective are really questions that tap into that mechanistic overview of why social support works. And they're not just descriptive questions identifying that social support does work. It's more about the why and the mechanistic nature of it. So to conclude, the evidence does strongly support that social support is an important protective factor in PTSD. We said that at the beginning. We already know this. Well, there are some longitudinal studies that are, again, confirming that it happens longitudinally, but it might be reciprocal in terms of PTSD and support. We have identified these potential candidate mechanisms that can be important in terms of how we work with people after they've experienced traumatic stress events. But really what we need, or what the field needs, are much more rigorous and longitudinal studies. We need more systematic reviews that focus specifically in on these individual mechanisms. But even with those types of limitations, I think that the current literature does give us meaningful insights to answer the questions as to why this support matters. And the basic line of this is that support matters because trauma recovery is not just about the individual, it's a relational process about how the individual exists within their social world. And then just to really kind of drive a point home, our whole lab in Queen's University Belfast work in the biopsychosocial model. So my talk today has been very specifically focused on the social world, but I am a big believer that everything has a role to play. So biology comes into play, psychology comes into play, and so does our social world. Just for some people, at some times, under different circumstances, one thing might be important than the other. But I think future research really does need to focus in on the relational world as to how we support individuals after they've experienced potentially traumatizing events. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Cherie, for this fantastic talk, guiding us through the world of social support. You know, I'm a strong believer in social support. I'm also much more, have been involved in the neurobiology of social support, and I think the solution is just to put oxytocin in our drinking water. But seriously, I think your last point on the slide, I was actually looking forward to hear that. In these times where we have increasing wars and increasing levels of traumatization around the world, it is so important to learn what we can do also early after trauma in terms of possibly increasing social support. So we don't really have any tested interventions on social support. Or what can you say about that? And then I will open to the public, of course, so it's not just my question.
And I think that's a very important point. So I'm not a clinical psychologist by my trade. I don't work with patients, but I work with a lot of people who are clinical psychologists. And in my discussions with them on this, they really don't think that there are interventions or treatments that really hone in on the social support. Now, of course, we do have things like family systems therapy and so on that will be looking at the relational dynamics, but I do think that more focus on these mechanistic things and feeding that into interventions and treatments is going to be a way forward.
Thank you. Any questions from the audience?
Yes. Thank you very much for this very rich and interesting presentation. It was really pleasure listening to you. I have one question and one remark. The first question concerning the studies that you discussed about veterans, social support among veterans. Well, I was wondering about moral injury because veterans and soldiers, and we knew from the unfortunate recent wars that they are sometimes that they sometimes act not according to their values, or that they do things that they maybe trigger later on a lot of shame and regret, and that they live with this, you mentioned the sense of coherence. And I was wondering if there were any studies in social support in this kind specific of moral injury, especially that sometimes collective narratives may reinforce ideas of banalizing or minimizing the distress or suffering of the victims, of the civilians that inevitably are going to be targeted in wars. This was the first question. And another just small remark, you mentioned admirably the psychosocial mechanism. I think also there have been emerging studies, even though still experimental, about the neurobiological correlates of the psychosocial mechanism, especially regarding the accelerated aging, so how social support can reverse accelerated biological aging, and also about how it can also at the level of the amygdala also, which I found very interesting because it really correlates with the specific psychosocial mechanism that you mentioned, how it also can decrease the chronic hyperactivation of the amygdala. So I think it's also interesting to understand that these are, as you mentioned later on, really intertwined and interconnected, and there are also neurobiological correlates to our psychosocial mechanism. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So to come back on your first question about moral injury and research on social support and moral injury in military veterans specifically, I can't think off the top of my head of a specific study, but what I can say is that the concept of moral injury and the kind of additional symptoms or like things around it in terms of that sense of abandonment and sense of being let down and so on, then that's really going to feed into social support and changing that appraisal and that narrative, but probably much more on a societal and organizational level rather than the individual level. So I don't know specific studies, but I can absolutely see how those mechanisms will work at the higher level of the society and organizations. And then your second point about the neurobiological mechanisms, and that's an area of work that I work less in. So obviously today I've presented much more on the social space, but absolutely there will be, as I said, by a psychosocial model, there will be lots of different mechanisms from the biology side. And what we need to do in this space is we need to collaborate interdisciplinary, where we do large-scale studies that look at predicting risk in a biopsychosocial framework. And actually the study I presented today very briefly, the MAVIDA study with the Colombian people exposed to armed conflict, the very nature of that study is to develop a biopsychosocial risk model. So we have all the psychology and social stuff being collected through interviews and surveys, but we also collected 562 saliva samples from our participants at baseline, and we ran a translational model with zebrafish where we were knocking out candidate genes with our partners, looking specifically at neuroligin 1 as a stress response in zebrafish to see how we can translate that over to our saliva samples. And that all sounds great, but I don't have any results yet because the samples are currently at Yale being analysed with our partners, so that's a kind of wait and see how that plays out, but it's the integration of the biopsychosocial modelling will be much more informative, I think, than focusing on one piece of the puzzle.
Thank you. Any other questions? Okay.
Is it easier?
It's
just
I got it, but maybe you want to translate it.
She was talking about a study that was conducted in the 1930 about adolescents, I think, that and they showed that having warm links with others had a protective effect on their mental health. And this is quite an old study. Still, it has it shows the same thing as you were showing here. So
it's a remark.
Yeah, it's more of a remark than a question.
Yeah, and just thank you for that comment. So just to come back on that, I guess that's the point I'm trying to make through the theme of the talk. So the point is not, is social support a protective factor? Of course it is. We've seen this for a very long time. We've seen this in the theoretical work. We've seen this in the empirical work. But what we really need to do now is get to the nuance of why it works, so that we can use that more detailed information to feed it back to interventions and treatments. So yes, thank you for sharing that reflection, and that's an older study than I had even thought about, so thank you.
Yes.
Thank you so much, and sorry for my English. I have a question because I work in addictology, and I have a lot of patients that have both PTSD and addiction, and of course the addiction have impact on social support. And we talk about the hunger that make like an impact on social support, but obviously there are some blame and judgment about the addiction. And as you have lot of population in your study, I don't know if you have this part of addiction in lot of your study or no.
Yeah, so we have lots of data in which we have used the audit, so the alcohol use disorders identification test. So we can, within our data, every data set I have presented today, in fact, we have the audit in, it's just not really a feature or an interest of us in our lab. So we haven't looked at it in that context, but you can absolutely see how the additional complication of addiction and how society perceives addiction and reasons for addiction, and whether it's medicalized or socialized or so on, and how that can disrupt those social relationships. So I would imagine that the addiction per se has more disruption on social relationships, so removes the social support. So that's maybe why we see high levels of comorbidity between those who have addictive disorders or problematic usage of alcohol and drugs, even in terms of developing mental health outcomes. So not just PTSD, but also depression, anxiety, a whole range of different mental ill health outcomes. There's high comorbidity with the alcohol use disorders, but it's not something we've specifically looked at in that data. But what I can tell you is we have the information and the data to look at. So thank you for the inspiration.
Okay, are there more questions? Because if not, I think it's time to thank you again, Cherie, for this excellent talk. And I pass the word on to Fabien.
Bien. Merci, merci encore, Cherie. Thank you very much. Merci Miranda aussi. Merci Coralie.
Fabien.
Ok, vous m'entendez là? Oui, très bien. Donc on va, avant de clôturer le colloque, on va procéder dans un premier temps à la remise des prix des posters. Donc comme on l'avait annoncé, il y avait 2 prix qui... Toujours plus bas. Je vais avoir des problèmes de dos d'ici la fin de... Donc nous allons annoncer les 2 prix qui seront attribués dans le cadre du colloque pour les posters. Donc comme j'avais pu l'indiquer, on a 2 prix, un prix du jury et un prix du public. On va commencer par le premier prix du public. Donc nous avions établi une méthodologie au départ. Il y avait des votes du public. On a eu 14 500 votes. Non, je plaisante, mais il y avait un nombre significatif de votes, bien plus important que le nombre de participants au congrès, même si nous étions complets. Donc la procédure que nous avons choisi d'utiliser, c'est de se baser sur les votes pour les adresses mail des personnes qui étaient inscrites. Ce qui me semble finalement assez juste. Donc pour remettre ce prix, j'ai le plaisir d'inviter Noémie Richard, donc, qui est directrice générale du Cn2r, à nous rejoindre.
Donc merci Fabien. C'est un réel plaisir pour moi de remettre ce prix du public dans le cadre de ce colloque scientifique du Cn2r. Ce prix a une signification particulière puisqu'il reflète directement le regard et l'intérêt des participants au colloque pour les travaux présentés. Il vient saluer non seulement la qualité scientifique du poster, mais aussi sa capacité à susciter la discussion et le partage. Et j'ai vu que c'était assez mouvementé et animé autour des posters. Donc encore merci à vous tous. Donc je tiens à féliciter également l'ensemble des auteurs pour la richesse des travaux présentés lors de ce colloque. Et j'ai maintenant le plaisir de remettre le prix du public à, roulement de tambour, Cn2r de l'Université de Paris-Nantes pour le poster intitulé « Same symptoms, different trauma, different mental health states, different treatment targets ». Félicitations.
Merci à tous. J'aimerais particulièrement remercier... Ouais, je vais avoir des problèmes de dos aussi, du coup. J'aimerais surtout remercier Madame Alice Heinloff-Brunet qui m'a permis d'avoir l'opportunité de présenter ce poster. Et j'espère que ce sera publié bientôt pour que je puisse partager avec vous tous. Si jamais, n'hésitez pas à regarder le mail sur le poster, comme ça on pourra en discuter. Merci en tout cas.
Pour annoncer le second prix, je laisse le micro au professeur Guillaume Veva, qui va nous faire un petit speech.
Bien, bonjour à tous. Et franchement, je suis très, très heureux de remettre ce prix du jury, parce qu'à côté des 14 000 votants, il y avait quand même un jury scientifique qui était un peu moins intéressé. Voilà, je suis vraiment très heureux du choix qui s'est porté sur ce poster de Paloma Irlandaise, d'ailleurs que j'invite si jamais il est là, ou quelqu'un de son équipe, non visible, ah si, mais si, de l'équipe de l'Université de Lorraine. Parce que bon, à force de le répéter, je pense que tout le monde a compris, on n'expose pas les gens s'ils ne sont pas un minimum stabilisés. Maintenant, il est quand même temps de travailler sur comment on fait pour stabiliser de façon un peu rigoureuse. Tenez votre prix et dites-nous quelques mots de votre joli travail.
Merci. Bon, c'est assez inespéré, mon syndrome de l'imposteur est à bloc. Voilà. Je tiens à remercier toute l'équipe et le jury pour ce prix. C'est vrai que ça me tient à cœur de porter ce travail avec ma direction de thèse et toute l'équipe de la Maison des Lacs qui a participé à que ce soit possible. Bien évidemment, je ne vais pas rappeler, vous l'avez tous vu sur le poster, l'importance de la stabilisation et j'espère que ces travaux vont perdurer dans le temps et que cette thèse va se finir bientôt. Je l'espère aussi, ça me rassurera. Mais en tout cas, merci beaucoup.
Me revoici donc pour clôturer cette fois-ci le colloque. Alors voilà, je voulais vous remercier toutes et tous. Je pense qu'on sera d'accord que ce colloque a permis de mettre en lumière à quel point il y a la richesse et la diversité des travaux autour de la question du soutien social en psychotrauma. Je pense aussi que les différentes interventions ont montré à quel point il y avait la nécessité d'une approche croisée entre les savoirs académiques, la recherche, les savoirs cliniques et aussi les savoirs expérientiels. On a abordé les aspects mécanistiques en lien avec les effets du soutien social. Je pense que là aussi, la voix des personnes concernées serait très pertinente et, pour aller plus loin dans la compréhension de ces liens entre soutien social et psychotrauma. En tout cas, voilà, croiser savoir académique, clinique et savoir expérientiel, c'est vraiment la vocation du Cn2r. Et voilà, j'espère que ce message sera passé à travers cette journée et demie. Pour terminer, je remercie l'ensemble des intervenants, des modérateurs, des différents partenaires qui ont contribué à ce colloque. Je remercie également les équipes du Cn2r qui ont été mobilisées pour l'organisation, à la fois sur les aspects logistiques, mais aussi au niveau scientifique. Et puis, je vous souhaite un excellent retour et à la prochaine. Merci.